Social media, αυτή η μάστιγα. Είναι πλέον σύνηθες να κατηγορούνται για όλα τα δεινά των νέων. Τι ισχύει όμως? Έπειτα από αντιλαϊκή απέτηση, βάλθηκα να κάνω ένα σχετικό βίντεο. Και εκεί που είχα λιώσει τη βιβλιογραφία, σκέφτηκα, αντί να τα λέω εγώ, ας καλέσω έναν ειδικό να μας τα πει από πρώτο χέρι. Κάλεσα λοιπόν τον Κρίστοφερ Φέργκισον, καθηγητή ψυχολογίας από το Πανεπιστήμιο Στέτσον της Φλόριντα, με ισχυρή παρουσία στην έρευνα των social media και στην ουσία είναι ο άνθρωπος πίσω από το μισό μου βίντεο για την νεανική βία. Μέχρι το τέλος θα έχουμε μάθει τι ισχύει για τις επιδράσεις των social media στην ψυχική υγεία, τι ακριβώς δείχνει η έρευνα και κατά πόσο μάλλον έχουμε εμπλακεί σε έναν ηθικό πανικό. Καλή προβολή.
Either a 0% effect or like a 1% effect. That's the debate.
So, Mr. Ferguson, we are here to discuss about the impacts of the social media in the mental health and the other outcomes on youth and why not on adolescents. In a recent case here in Greece, a 22-year-old died after attempting to swallow a whole burger as a part of a social media challenge with his friends.
Yeah.
As a psychologist and researcher myself, yourself, how do you interpret such incidents? Furthermore, every now and then we hear about some violent incidents between adolescents that record their acts and upload them on social media.
Yeah.
And the discourse here in Greece, I believe it's not a Greek phenomenon, between psychologists is that that has something to do with social media and their negative impact on mental health of adolescents.
Yeah.
First of all, what's your take on those incidents? Of course, the burger attempt to swallowing burger.
Don't try to eat a burger in one bite, no matter how hungry you are.
You don't enjoy it. You don't enjoy it.
First off, you should enjoy the burger. You should savor it, right? You know, the burgers. Yeah. Well, I mean, kids have been doing stupid stuff for a long time. I mean, there's always this risk of, anecdotes, right? We know kind of like anecdotes are not really evidence, right? That you can find an anecdote to support. I mean, if you wanted to say that schools are horrible, right? You could find easily thousands of anecdotes. Kids who are harmed by schools, you know what I mean? And millions, maybe, across the U.S. and Europe and this kind of stuff, right?
Worldwide phenomenon, so you say.
Yeah, schools are dangerous for kids. Let's get rid of them, and kids would love this, So it's always dangerous to. I mean, there are lots of problems with anecdotes. I mean, usually like the reality is more complicated than any kind of simple narrative. That maybe there are more things going on than is simply being reported in the news media. So, obviously, I don't know. That's the other thing. I don't know the circumstances behind this particular.
Nobody knows. That exactly.
Yeah. What was going on?
I think my focus is on the discourse. Many reporters and psychologists emphasize the impact, the thing that the challenge thing.
Yeah.
And I heard one reporter saying that why cannot an algorithm that just take down all these stupid challenges?
Yeah.
So the problem solved.
Yeah. So I mean, kids have been doing stupid shit for a long time. I mean, so kids doing since they've been kids, and this idea that like one kid, dares another kid to do something dumb, and then that kid does it and dies, is not new to the social media age. I mean, this is a phenomenon of adolescence, going on forever, essentially. So, I mean, you can kind of look at like the data on like youth accidental deaths and stuff like that, right? We don't really see any evidence that like accidental deaths, in the U.S., it depends how you define like an accidental death. I mean, to some extent, I mean, in the U.S., we've had this like opioid epidemic, right? So you see some young adults and even some older teens who are overdosing, but that's also true for middle-aged adults. It's nothing to do with social media. So if you kind of like try to exclude some of that stuff, I mean, there's not really any evidence that sort of like dumb challenges is a scourge on teens. Now you could say like, you know, every death's a tragedy. That certainly is absolutely the case, but you know, but we had to watch out for these things too, because there have been a number of these, you know, challenges that, you know, turned out to be completely false. It'd be that there was like the Momo challenge, if you remember that one, and the blue whale and all this kind of
Blue
stuff.
whale, I remember the blue
Yeah,
whale,
I
blue
remember
whale.
that one. Yeah.
Yes,
So
yeah.
like essentially no kids were ever confirmed to have died, you know, as a result of these things. And, you know, and there's all this big media hype, you know, and it's always kind of funny too, because with some of these things, like I'm sure it's the case with the burger challenge, it's like, you know, the latest threat to your child, you know, the burger challenge. Has your kid heard of the burger challenge? The burger challenge is killing kids. Has your kid, you know, come across the burger challenge? And the answer is no, not until you mention it on national television. You know what I mean? So some of this like fear-based hype, right, is actually
Yeah, I know.
creating some of
Maybe
this.
we can say that burgers kill more kids, but another way, the
Yeah.
natural way. It's
I'm
they are
convinced
dangerous, but
that-
in a natural way. They're just eating them. It's more dangerous, maybe statistically
yeah.
more dangerous, of course. But
I'm convinced it's going to be vegetables that are the killer, right? You know, so, but you could look at, I mean, in terms of like the argument about crime, you know, what's happening, of course, is now some kids can film their crimes, which they couldn't do 40 years ago. That certainly is true. Which is stupid, by the way. If you're going to commit a crime, don't film it. Put it on YouTube. You know, you're gonna get caught. You know, uh, but if you look at like violent crime, you know, I don't know about in Greece, you know, but in the U.S., I mean, violent crime is at record lows.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
we've seen the steady
I've presented your work in my video about
Yeah.
violent crime between among adolescents.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen this like precipitous drop in violent crime since the early 90s, really.
Yeah,
You know, and
yeah,
it stayed steadily down for what is that now, like 30 some year, 35 years, you know, basically. You know, I know we have this reputation of being, you know, hyper, it's because we have a lot of, you know, guns and that kind of stuff. So we have this reputation of being very violent, but actually we're not. I mean, you know, there are bad neighborhoods where, you know, gun violence happens, but, you know, yeah, most of us don't live in those neighborhoods. You know what I mean? So we just don't come across it that much. You know, and you're actually more likely to be beaten up in some European countries, not Greece, thankfully, but like the UK and France and Belgium have higher assault rates than we do in the US. You know, but no, we just don't see like the technical age has created this kind of like problem. Bullying is down, even if you include cyberbullying into the numbers. You know, that like fewer and fewer kids today are reporting being bullying victims, and that drop happened during the social media and smartphone, you know, age. So we're just not seeing this kind of like data evidence. So yeah, I mean, you could find a scary sounding, awful, tragic anecdote to support like literally anything. You could support that like church is killing kids by finding some kid that died in the church, you know, at some point. It's a big world, you know, and people do dumb things, you know, and sometimes it's just some people are, you know, I don't want to like, you know, make fun of the poor kid that died or anything, but people sometimes make bad choices, you know, and sometimes those bad choices rebound in tragic ways, you know, on their lives. And that's really the story. It's just that sometimes people make bad choices. They always have, they always will. It's nothing new in the social media and smartphone age.
So to recapitulate this point, I believe we have these 2 points here.
Yeah.
That will compass us the whole discussion. I believe, and I think you believe also that stupidity is a worldwide phenomenon,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
a phenomenon that exists through millennia.
Mm-hmm.
First
Yeah.
of all, and second of all, the fact that we are recording something and we are making it public,
Yeah.
makes it more dramatic, I believe.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it's easier to, you know, ignore things that you don't see, right? You know what I mean? So if you think of like so you know, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, you know, in the United States, and like I can both from the data and from my memory, I can say like kids today experience less bullying and aggression in schools than they did back then. But now it's easier to see it because everybody's filming it, right? So we have this thing called the availability heuristic, right? That if you can remember these kind of like vivid anecdotes, people tend to, you know, overestimate how often something is happening. So we have a lot of people that think that like schools are more violent than they ever were, that, you know, there's more violent crime than there ever was, when the data suggests exactly the opposite, right? That actually all of these problems, you know, are at much lower levels than before. Actually, kids today in the United States, you know, there is this mental health issue, of course. I assume we're going to talk about that, but on other issues, kids today in the United States are as good as they've been. They use drugs less, they smoke less, they're less violent, they get pregnant less, they stay in school more, they volunteer more. I mean, on all these different, you know, outcomes, you know, things are behavioral outcomes at very least. You know, you can find these, you know, very positive trends. And what's kind of funny is with all these narratives about like video games or social media or smartphones or now AI, of course, is, you know, there's this negativity bias, right? So someone will look for a negative trend and ascribe that causally to technology, but they'll ignore all these positive trends. So nobody's out there saying that, like, thank God for smartphones because violent crime is the lowest level it's been in 35 years, you know, and that's due to the internet, you know.
Yeah.
Nobody's saying this, even though that's exactly what happened in terms of. I'm not saying, I'm not making a causal claim here, but in terms of time, you know, violent crime went down as soon as the internet showed up. You know what I mean? It's been going down ever since. You know, teen pregnancy has been going down since the internet showed up, and so on and so forth. But nobody's making those causal attributions, and they shouldn't, right? Because that's just correlational data. But all we do is we focus in on the negative and make causal attributions about the sort of negative data, and we ignore the positives. And we thought for a minute we probably would see what the problem with that kind of thing, like that kind of thinking is.
Yeah, I see. So, where do you think this debate begins? I believe it's around 2015 with the book of Jim Twain, the Generation Z, and
Yeah.
the work of Jonathan Hyde, especially the bestseller here in Greece, also the Anxious Generation is a little bit more new, around the 2020. They depict there a very negative, a very negative picture about on social media. What's your take on their work, and what do you think are the biggest methodological or statistical problems with their arguments?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there's it's like the worst American export ever, right? Sorry about that. You're saying it was like the bestseller in Greece.
Yeah.
Whoops. Well, you know, a lot of people waste a lot of money on a very bad book. Well, I mean, I think this has been. I mean, it's really been going on longer. I mean, so you kind of see these, you know, ups and downs and the sort of narrative in that. Um, you know, for most of the 2000s, it really was video games, right? Everybody's focusing on video game violence, and that was really the what was absorbing all the oxygen. And it seems like we're at a point where we've, you know, sort of given up on this idea that video game violence causes aggression or
Mm.
violent crime. Like we're sort of moving past that particular
Yeah,
moral
I
panic.
believe so. It's an old debate. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it just
The
doesn't
impact
get as
on
much
social
energy, you know, as
violent
it.
video games.
And so I think, yeah, what's happening is there's a replacement cycle, right? You know, you kind of like stop worrying about one thing and then you worry about the next thing, you know. So that's just kind of where social media and smartphones kind of came in. So you would see people like in the early 2010s, you know, there was like the American Psychiatric, or excuse me, the American Academy of Pediatrics released this like Facebook depression, like a statement. I think it was in 2010, 2011, somewhere in that range. And everybody kind of made fun of it at the time. Like it wasn't taken super seriously. Even some of the scholars they cited criticized it as big. You know, yeah, their work was cited improperly. Um, so it didn't have a lot of impact. And then again, I think we're still at that point getting out of the video game panic. And then there was this kind of like, you know, Gene Twenge had written this article in the Atlantic that sort of, you know, has smartphones destroyed a generation, you know, and there's what I forget, there's this rule like in newspaper headlines, like if a newspaper headline ends in a question mark, then the answer is no, right? You know, but nonetheless, it's just an op-ed. It was her making this argument. Now, you know, she had previously made claims about there being a narcissism epidemic in millennials. So she kind of has this like history of making these big, broad, generational negative claims. It's turned out, I would say, pretty conclusively that there never was a narcissism epidemic. You know, the other scholars have analyzed her work and found that it's not true. that the millennials have this narcissism, but which is kind of funny because we've all kind of forgotten about the narcissism epidemic, right? Because those millennials are now like 40, right? And they have kids, and they're buying books. So there does seem to be this kind of like narrative shift that happens that, okay, we can't worry about the narcissism epidemic anymore because those people have grown up and are buying books. They're the audience now. So now we have to complain about their kids, and what's wrong with their kids. That becomes like the Gen Z, kind of, they're all mentally ill, sort of narrative, even though it's in many ways the opposite, of what she was claiming with the narcissism epidemic. Now it's all this like, culture and social media is causing narcissism, and now conveniently it's causing the opposite, of like suicide and depression and anxiety and all these other things. So yeah, and I don't think it's a very data-based argument. But that's not how you sell books. You sell books with like scary, and then just couple together some like little trends, anecdotes, like you mentioned, just to kind of, it's cherry picking, is deliberate cherry picking of information to be as scary as possible, because that's what sells. It's scary, basically. And then I think actually to some extent during the pandemic, social media experienced a bit of a renaissance in a way that people were kind of thankful for social media, right? Well, the social media is going to help kids. Kids can stay home where they won't infect grandma, but they can still talk to their friends on social media. They can still talk to their family on social media. So at least briefly, there was kind of like this positivity around social media, but that didn't last, and then, as soon as we got out of the pandemic, people went back to worrying about it. And then you had, the anxious generation, with Height that came out in 2023, which has been pretty broadly criticized by scholars as absolute nonsense. But nonetheless, it paints this very frightening picture that is, palatable to policymakers. It confirms parents' worst fears. And it's a money generator, right? It's
Money
basically
generator. That's harsh. That's very that's a claim.
but it's true. He's made millions of dollars. He charges $100,000 a day in speaker fees, right? This kind of stuff. And now he's got a charity. He's created a charity around this stuff, which is a little weird, in a way. But so I think we have to remember sometimes that, like, I mean, it's okay to be suspicious of big tech and big companies, and of course they're cynical and they're out to get money. They don't exist to help anybody, nor should they. I mean, it's not their primary. We shouldn't think that they should. I mean, that's what they're capitalist enterprises, right? But that's also true of like the sphere industry, right? And there is also this like parasitic parallel industry that makes money off of our fears about stuff, and so we're always being exposed to newspaper headlines about like what's going to kill us and what's going to kill our kids and what's going to like ruin our lives, and and all this kinds of stuff. Like, it's just over and over and over again, and news media profit from it. Politicians profit from it. Some companies profit from it directly because they sell products that's supposed to protect kids. And then, some scholars profit from it, with best-selling books and speaking engagements and apparently creating their own charities and all kinds of other stuff. So I think we need to be aware of, yes, it's fine to be suspicious of Meta or Twitter. I don't think they're angelic companies, but at the same point, we should be suspicious of the people that are trying to scare the shit out of us, because they're making money off of that too, and their designs, I think, in many ways are just as cynical as the tech companies that we're, focused in on. So, yeah.
Okay, so let's go a little bit more technical here. What the biggest methodological flaws in those studies? I believe, of course, correlation is not causation, first of all.
Right.
And then what?
Well, I mean, first off, I mean, with all due respect, I mean, Haidt doesn't conduct any studies. He's not, which, I mean, he's a smart guy. I'm not saying that, someone who's educated shouldn't be able to, have their opinion or even publish, in an area they're not necessarily familiar with. But he does virtually no research, in this area. And that's not to say that we shouldn't listen to his opinion at all, but rather the fact that he's, I think someone once described, I think it was Taylor Lorenz once described him as the Kool-Aid man. It's like, I don't know if you have that in Greece, the Kool-Aid man. It's a commercial that we have here in the US where there's like big, jar of Kool-Aid and bangs his way through the walls, and it's like, here I am, kind of a thing, probably an American reference. I apologize for that. But he's had an incredible influence over this field, despite having no fucking idea what he's talking about. Essentially, he really is not involved in the research in this area, at all. When she has, I mean, she has done some studies, to her credit. So she's more knowledgeable than Haidt is, by far. Even though I think that the way she communicates her studies is not great for the most part. But yeah, actually, we don't really have good evidence of correlation, let alone causation. Most of the studies we have tend to find, you might find like small correlations, what we call bivariate correlations. That means like literally you just have the two variables. And so you might find that like social media time correlates with self-reported depression a tiny bit, like 1% of the variance is explained, So, another way of thinking of that, if all you knew about someone was how much time they spent on social media, and you were trying to predict how depressed they would be, your odds of predicting who would be depressed would be about 1% better than chance, which is very, very, very low, essentially. But that's not controlling for anything else, right? Now, maybe, people who are experiencing more stress will spend more time on social media and will be more depressed. People who have difficult families may spend more time on social media, and may have more depression.
So
People who come
you're
from
talking about excuse me, you're talking about reverse causation here.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure, that could be thought of as a reverse causation thing, or at least there's like a third variable that's basically causing two different things, right? So yeah, I mean, you could have a situation where people who are more stressed, this is reverse causality, that people who are more stressed are going online because they're either trying to engage in mood management, they're trying to de-stress themselves, or they're trying to learn about their situation in order to try to deal with it better, or they're socializing, right? They're spending time with friends on social media, and that is calming them down and things like that. I mean, there are other things too. I mean, one of the things we know too is a lot of this data is unfortunately, based on self-report, which is unreliable. So what we tend to see is when we look at suicide data, we don't tend to see much of a correlation at all. There's really nothing there, in terms of like, suicide data.
Talking about suicide, I found a big article that came out recently. It was talking about the just owning a smartphone under the age of 13 years old was correlating with greater suicidal ideation.
Yeah.
Just owning. They couldn't measure anything else. They couldn't
Yeah.
measure the use. They couldn't measure time spent. They couldn't measure which type of social media was the kid consuming. But they found this correlation.
Yeah.
And
I don't know about that study. I'm not sure which one you're referring to. I have an idea of which one it might be, and I'll get to that in a second.
Maybe I can find it, and I tell you.
Labs?
I found it. Protecting the developing mind in a digital age, a global policy imperative.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, what I can say is every other study that's looked at this has not found that. That we across studies do not find a correlation between owning a smartphone and suicidal ideation. In fact, there was a study from USF that came out recently that found the opposite, if I remember correctly, that kids that had smartphones actually were doing better mentally than kids without smartphones. So yeah, I think what oftentimes happens too, when we're in this kind of period of a moral panic, that we tend to see that like studies that find an effect get a lot more attention than those that don't. And the other thing to watch out for, and again, I haven't seen this particular study, that oftentimes you'll see the headline and even the abstract of the study, the title of the study sounds scary.
Yeah.
And then you look at the study itself, and either it's so badly done or the effect size is so tiny that it's probably statistical noise. That it's probably just a random nonsense finding. But it gets hyped, right? It gets hyped in a very, very scary way. So what I can assure parents who gave their kids a smartphone when they were like 13 or whatever, is they're going to be fine, because we just don't across studies see this kind of effect. Even if you look at like national trends in the United States, like, changes in youth's screen time, as kids have shifted to like more smartphones and social media and that sort of stuff, is not correlated with suicide, in the United States. What we tend to find is correlated with suicide is, what we call adverse childhood events, being exposed to, parents who've died, parents who've committed suicide, parents who are incarcerated, of course, parental abuse, physical or sexual abuse, all that tends to correlate. Exposure to bullying in school tends to correlate highly with teen suicide. We just do not find that exposure to screens, technology. And we've done lots of studies with like, data from the CDC and this kind of stuff. We just do not find good evidence that time spent on smartphones or social media is, related to suicidal ideation, suicide level depression or anything, of that sort. So, so it's just not a consistent finding that we tend to find. So my best guess, sight unseen, maybe it's a great study. I don't know. Maybe it would change my mind if I, looked at it. We should all be open to that.
I don't think so.
No.
It's from the Global Mind Project. I don't know if you are aware of it.
Oh, I think that is the one I was thinking of, actually. Yeah. Okay. So fun fact about that, if that's from that study, I have that data, and no, owning a smartphone is not correlated with mental health. So that's the Sapien Labs. That's the Sapien Lab study. Yeah, no, that's the one I was thinking of. No, I can tell you, I've seen that data. I've reanalyzed that data, and no, that study does not, in fact, show that smartphone ownership is associated. What it does show is just what I told you, that is that adverse childhood events predict mental health issues, not owning a smartphone. The other thing that's sort of a trick with that particular study is, as I remember it, it's conducted with adults. So they had to remember if they were given a smartphone when they were a child and that kind of stuff. So that's another limitation of that study, because what you also tend to find in a lot of these studies as a limitation is that people who are depressed tend to overestimate their screen time. So what you'll sometimes find is that if you ask people, when did you get a smartphone? How many hours do you spend on social media? And then you ask them, how depressed are you? You'll find, again, usually a small correlation, not a large one, but a small correlation. But if you have a tracker, so, you have an app on their phone or whatever that actually tracks their screen time, then there's nothing. So there's a biasing effect in a lot of self-report data that's causing false positive correlations to pop up in that data.
And I believe the majority of the research is based upon the recalling the screen use.
Well, most of the data is self-report. Yeah, so that's another limitation. And I think if you like go back to like the anxious generation and books like that it tends to rely very heavily on a lot of self-report data, oftentimes with measures that are not really clinical anyway. You're just asking people like, how happy are you with your life and that kind of stuff. I think they get into a little bit of like hospital admission data and this kind of stuff, like self-injury data in hospitals. But it's turned out there have been studies that have now found that this is the other thing you have to watch out with, like time trend data, that reporting standards change. So during the middle of the 2010s, most countries got more stringent in terms of their reporting standards. So hospitals had to report more injuries as if they were self-report than they'd had in the past. So you have another historical confound, essentially. There's also the issue that in 2013, the DSM, right, the American Psychiatric Association, changed their diagnoses for everything. It became easier to be diagnosed with most mental health disorders in the 2010s. So that's another historical confound you tend to end up with. So that's why it's very, very hard to look at like time trend data and make much of it, because oftentimes you see people say like, look at this data. What else could it be other than smartphones? And then like, within half an hour, you've got a list of like 20 other things it could be, and what's happening is people just are not that curious. They're looking for data to support their pre-existing beliefs, and they're not kicking the tires. They're not, testing that data to see if it's rigorous enough or if there are other, explanations. So I've actually done this with like, time trend data on suicide in the United States. So what we had in the United States, of course, is that teen suicide went up in the 2010s, which is not true for most of European countries, by the way. I don't know about Greece specifically, but
it's very low among youth. Very, very,
yeah,
very.
okay, yeah. So
We have one of the lowest rates in the world.
yeah. Well, Greece is beautiful. Why would you not want to live more in Greece? You know, it's I've been. I loved it. You know, it's a fantastic country. Yeah, and that's kind of what you see in most of Europe. I mean, you know, some countries are different, you know, but generally speaking, the cross Europe trend is pretty stable. So there wasn't this rise in like suicidal, you know, ideation in teens.
It's more an American phenomenon, we can say.
Yeah, it's a very specific American phenomenon. But what happened also is that middle-aged adults also started killing themselves more. In fact, much more than teens, you know. So it just happens to be that as a middle-aged white male, I'm actually in one of the top suicide demographics. Now, this is not a cry for help. I'm fine. I'm happy. Whatever, you know. But you know, so if you like look at like a teen girl, which is who everybody's worried about, and that's fine. We should be worried about teen girls. But you know, look at like a teen girl. Me as a 54-year-old white male, my odds of committing suicide are somewhere between 3 to 5 times the odds of a teen girl committing suicide. You know, and what we tend to see is that those things track together. In other words, as parents started to kill themselves, their teens also, to a lesser degree, rose in more or less the same pattern. And even if you use these like more sophisticated time trend analyses, you tend to find that like earlier parent suicides predict later teen suicides. So that's, you know, again, it's still correlational data. We can't say it's causal necessarily, but it at least conforms this kind of like time pattern that you would expect from that. We don't see that with social media. We don't see that with screens, you know. So it seems to be, if the United States, if we were having a problem with teens, it's because they were having a problem with their parents, you know. So we had a lot of parents dying from, you know, overdoses. You know, we had an opioid epidemic in the U.S. Things are not looking as rosy in the U.S. as they are in Greece, I guess. Yeah. You know, we had parents committing suicide at much higher levels. You know, and so if you're like 14 years old and your parent kills themselves, I mean, of course you have a higher risk of you know, killing yourself as well. And for some reason, people like just did not look at those two pieces of data together. Somehow, now we're not going to worry about the middle-aged adults. We're only going to look at the teens, and we're going to look at what teens do, which is, you know, screens, and not make the connection that, I mean, I think it's kind of obvious, and you know that, and again, I think the data support this. Multiple pieces of data support this. That one of the biggest problems teens are having are their families, but that's not what people want to hear necessarily. So,
Yes, I see. So speaking of teenage girls,
yeah,
there is a segment in Hyde's book about the gender differences in the impact of social media. He says about the teenage girls are more influenced about their image. How do they seem to other people, and that's not so obvious in boys. Are you aware of this? Have you?
yeah, that's a common refrain. Now, what I can assure you is, if the data had looked the opposite way, then we'd be talking about boys, right? This is all post hoc reasoning, right? You know, you could come up with a reason why boys would be more impacted by social media if that's what you wanted to do to help sell your book, right? You know what I mean? Like, this is all, there was no a priori hypothesis. This is all post hoc, trying to fit the data to the explanation. What you would see in some early studies, this is where this came from, is you would tend to see, like in some of Twingy's data, for instance, when she ran these big data sets with like hundreds of thousands of teenagers, essentially, or young adults, she would find no correlation for boys between social media use and mental health, but she would find tiny correlations between social media use and mental health for girls. So that's kind of like the origin point of this whole argument. Now, those correlations were so small that they're the same correlation as wearing eyeglasses and suicide. So it's like for any of your listeners who are stats minus, a correlation of about 0.06, you know, R 0.06. If you don't know that, don't worry about it. That's a little bit in baseball. So, but we don't like run around and warn parents not to give their teenage girls eyeglasses, right? You know, or, you know, don't let them eat potatoes. That was the other one. There was a correlation between eating potatoes and suicide. Now, what happens is like you say, what the hell? jails and suicide? Why? No, it's not real. It's noise. If you run 600,000 people through an analysis, almost everything becomes statistically significant, essentially. So you want to be wary of that. Those words, statistical significance, really don't mean much. But they sound impressive, right? They sound like, well, this has got to be a big deal if it's significant, right? No, it doesn't. The term significance doesn't mean like what the general public thinks significance means.
Yeah, of course.
But that was kind of the origin point of this whole like, oh, it's girls not boys, thing. Now, if Twinsy had found that there was a correlation for boys and not girls, we'd all be about like what, like I said, it's post hoc rationalization. We'd all be talking about boys and not girls. But even that correlation really hasn't lasted very well in other analyses. So we just did a group of us in the UK and the US and Ireland, I think, just did a meta-analysis of these correlational and longitudinal studies. So these are studies of kids, their screen use, and their mental health. And we found across studies, now, of course, some studies find effects, some studies don't find effects. Some studies find that social media use makes their kids are better, in terms of, so the studies are kind of all over the place.
Is this your meta-analysis you published?
Yeah,
it's this one.
This is the one with Linda Kay and Patrick Markey. So we did this meta-analysis, and we found that if you combine the studies together, there was no impact. So actually, and this is again why to watch out for news reports, because news reports may only report some of those studies, but not the other studies. So you get a false view of what's going on in the research. But across studies, we did not find any correlation at all. So no correlation. It's not even correlation doesn't equal causation. There's no correlation, and it didn't matter if it was boys or girls, So for neither sex was there a correlation between time spent on social media and mental health.
Sure, but I cannot bring here the response from Mr. Hyde.
Yeah.
Why Ferguson's meta-analysis should not be used to inform debates on social media's impact on depression and anxiety? A commentary.
Yeah. Well,
so, I found it very, very, very polemic. Having your name in the title.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I'll I'm trying to think of it. I'll be a little careful in my wording here, but so gently I'll point out that a gentleman who released a book that's a bestseller, making him millions of dollars, doesn't like a meta-analysis that challenges the central theory of his book. I don't find that surprising or necessarily terribly informative. You know what I mean? So I think there's a pretty, obvious conflict. I mean, I'm just going to say, I think he's got pretty obvious financial conflicts of interest at this point, in this field. But that's just my opinion. But obviously, I mean, science is a debated, thing. Not everybody's going to be convinced, and that's fine. I mean, a lot of it is that you do a study, that study is going to have some flaws. People are going to point out the flaws, so you do another one and a better one, and you see if does the hypothesis keep working out or does it not, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of how science should be. It absolutely should be critical. We all expect criticism and that kind of stuff. So it doesn't bother me, or whatever else. I just don't find it convincing. First off, he's not an expert in this field, and second, he's got pretty clear financial conflicts of interest. That doesn't mean that everybody, who is a scholar without conflict is going to love my meta-analysis. I don't think that's true, necessarily, but I think it is an important piece of the evidence. And I think, we've seen it's not the only meta-analysis, right? I mean, there have been a number of other meta-analyses, both of experimental studies, and I think he was referring to the experimental meta-analysis.
It's also your experimental meta-analysis.
Yeah. I think that. So there have now been 2 other meta-analyses that have reached basically the same conclusion, that the evidence is either null or very weak, to say that like reducing social media time improves mental health. So there seems to be this. Mine was the first that came out. He didn't like it. As you said, it kind of got a little ugly, somewhat, which is unfortunate. But then now it's been replicated twice, at this point. So, and those are by groups of people I'd never heard of before. They don't know me. I don't know them. They don't owe me anything. I don't know that they have any financial conflicts of interest. I can't say. I can only say I'm not being paid by the media industry or social media industry or anything like that. I don't have any best-selling books. Unfortunately, I'd love to have one, right? And I don't begrudge him having a best-selling book. I mean, more power to him. That's great, But I think we also have to recognize that it doesn't mean he's a bad guy, right? It's just human, He's now got an empire. He's got a media empire. He's got a fear-based media empire, and he's going to protect it. That's just human nature. Doesn't mean he's a bad person. But it does mean that we need to remember that, when we see his commentary, and I'll say up front, I don't think everybody should just buy what I say either, necessarily, right? I mean, that we're all humans, we all have opinions, and that's why I'm pointing out, like, okay, my meta-analysis wasn't perfect. I'll absolutely admit to that, but now it's been replicated twice, and if you look at like the correlational meta-analyses too, those have been replicated multiple times. The only argument between the meta-analyses are whether the effects are zero or almost zero. That's really it. That's the argument. Is it no effect or is it almost no effect? That's the big debate, in this area. None of the data suggests this kind of thing that like this is the big problem for teens today. It's either a 0% effect or like a 1% effect. That's the debate. None of the data says it's 25% or 50% or 75% of the problem that kids today are having.
Yeah, I see. So what about the another point of another debate? It's on the dopamine effect.
Oh, yeah.
And on the brain, and on the brain structures.
Yeah.
And I found one very good study that correlated the use of social media with the size of cerebellum. In I think 4 or 5-year-old kids. I try to
Yeah.
find it. Long-term impact of digital media on brain development in children.
Yeah.
Is it possible to change your brain chemistry and or brain structures if you use it, if you are a heavy user of social media?
I mean, it's a hypothesis that's worth raising, right? And what we want is like rigorous, pre-registered research to try to investigate this. What we often end up with is low quality research that is oftentimes with small sample sizes and not with rigorous methods. So we kind of went through this, and when you hear these things, it sounds dramatic. So I think we have to remember we went through this with video games, right? And you heard the same claims. Video games are going to change kids' brains. They're going to make them more aggressive. They're going to change these like frontal lobes or other parts of the brain that are involved in impulse control and all this kind of stuff. And now nobody thinks this, right? And what happened is, you see this like wave of initial studies that made these big claims. I even remember one saying that like playing video games would cause Alzheimer's disease. I think somewhere in there. So you see these like big scary claims, and then later like more scholars would come along and look at it closely with more rigorous studies and not be able to replicate it. So in other words, sometimes you would see a study would make a big claim, and then another study would come along and couldn't find the same effect. And you end up with this whack-a-mole kind of thing, right? Because like the brain is big and there's lots of different parts of it. And again, if you're trying to take one thing, like say screen use, and correlate it with the brain has literally thousands of different like parts, you know what I mean, that are doing different things at different times. You can cut that piece of bread in so many different ways. And if you're just like looking in there randomly, you're going to find something. Like literally you can find people that chew gum and don't chew gum, something's different in their brain at any given time that you look at this, right? And most of the stuff is not meaningful. It's just noise, once again. So a lot of these studies really are just like they're engaged in like a scavenger hunt. They don't know what they're looking for. They don't care. They're just going to try to find any correlation they can and then make it look like, this is a problem throughout social science, by the way. It's not just the brain imaging studies, but then they'll make it look like that was our hypothesis, all along, and then put it up with a big scary headline, and they get a lot of, attention and this kind of stuff. So generally speaking, no, we don't find much evidence that, again, that there's this kind of like replicable, brain change, that's abnormal. And of course, anytime we do anything, our brain's going to, react to it. But in terms of being like, this is going to like damage the brains of kids, no, we don't see this kind of evidence that would suggest, like Andy Shabilsky's done some work in this area recently, and with some of these like brain scan things, and doesn't find any evidence that like using social media or screens is associated with negative changes in the brain, and that kind of stuff. So again, I think we have to be alert for these kind of scary headlines that we're going to see. And oftentimes the truth is just that there's not that much there. And the problem with these brain imaging studies too is that, you see these beautiful pictures and they look so convincing because we like visual information. And there have been longstanding validity problems with those studies. It turns out how you set the machine can make those pictures pop sometimes in ways that are not very reliable. And so to give you an idea, there literally was a study that was done kind of for fun, but it actually did get kind of published and stuff. And what they had done to show just how unreliable these brain studies were is they put a dead salmon into an MRI machine, into an fMRI machine. So they made it look like this dead salmon would respond to emotional pictures. They could show its brain lighting up, like, when you showed it these like evocative images or whatever. And of course, it was all done for fun because it's a dead salmon. Its brain isn't doing anything, right? So it was just showing how these studies can be manipulated very easily by tweaking the machines and the statistics. So I think we always had to be a little bit careful. I'm not saying every study's bad, I mean, there are good brain imaging studies out there, but it's just showing how, careless or unscrupulous researchers can sometimes give us garbage results. Now, again, I'm not trying to pick on brain science. That's true for a lot of social science, as we know as well. It's true for a lot of medical science, right? We just have to be somewhat more critical thinking consumers of a lot of this information. We have to know we're going through a moral panic. We have to know that we're going to see a lot of scary headlines that are making broad claims based on junk science. We've seen this all before. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be maybe a little bit alert to, evidence of possible problems or harms or whatever else. But we also need to have, this like critical thinking awareness that we're going to come across a lot of bullshit. And we have to be ready for that and wary for that.
So you're saying that there is no great rewiring as
there is no great rewiring. No.
great rewiring.
And the whole dopamine thing, by the way, because you mentioned dopamine. Dopamine is a naturally occurring neurotransmitter. You can't get addicted to it. It's a normal thing that's in your brain. It's involved in this like anticipatory pleasure. So think of it like we're heading into Christmas season, right? As we're getting excited, that sense of like, oh boy, Santa's coming kind of thing. That's dopamine essentially. It's very, very. It's what makes life wonderful, right? And yeah, absolutely, it gets released if you're enjoying an activity like playing a video game or using social media in a way that's fun and interesting for you. It's not a hit. It's not like using methamphetamine. It has no comparable, relationship to cocaine or methamphetamine or other substances and that kinds of stuff. You don't get like a high from it in that same, kind of sense. It does feel somewhat pleasant, but it's the same thing you get from reading a book or talking to a friend or eating a pizza. If you enjoy learning from a class and you're excited to go, then it's the same thing. If you like going to church and you enjoy listening to the sermon at church, this is exactly the same. You can't like, max out on it. It doesn't matter if you're using it 1 hour, if you're having fun for 1 hour, 8 hours. If you send your kid to the playground and he plays sports on the playground for 8 hours, he's using dopamine in exactly the same way that he is, using it when he's home playing. There's no difference whatsoever.
There is no addiction to playgrounds.
Yeah, you can't get it. Well, it's funny. Linda Kay was involved in who's a co-author of mine on that meta-analysis. Did a study that I was not involved in some years ago, where again, tongue in cheek, she showed that by using these like self-report measures we sometimes see of like kids rating their video game addiction or social media addiction, that if you use these questions, you can make it look like people had friend addiction. Essentially that they were addicted to their real life friends. So yes, I mean that's
a nice addiction.
Well, I mean, if it's addicted, is addicted, right? The idea is that we have, even in the science, even in these studies, right? We've defined this idea of addiction so broadly that it's meaningless, and that the way that we interact with video games and social media, and for the most part, is not that different from how we interact with real life friends or with food or shopping or our pets or our friend or our family members, reading a book, that kind of stuff. It's all basically the same. Some people overdo all of these activities, but that seems to be an internal problem that they have, not a quality of the thing that they're overdoing necessarily. So you cannot become addicted to social media or video games in the same way that you can to like, opioids, and that's why we have a problem in the US is that, in the US, you had a lot of people who were told that you can take these pills and they're safe, and they were not, and that you had people who did not want to get high. That was never their goal, and they had pain, they had injuries and this kind of stuff, and they were told that these drugs were safe, and they went on these drugs, and then they ended up with addictions, right? And they never experienced euphoria or high, at least not to the same. That was never their goal, was to experience that. So that's what happens with substance abuse. You don't even need to want the addiction necessarily or the high from it. If you just start slipping cocaine into someone's drink, they'll get a physiological addiction to it. There's no comparison to that in any kind of behavior, whether we're talking about shopping, work, video games, food, sex, social media. It's just not the same thing.
So I don't know if you are aware about genetic influences. Since you talk about something innate. If you have something innate, you expose it, you saw it, you search it in the real life. So maybe are there some genetic predispositions to social media influence?
Yeah, there have been a few studies now that have suggested that exactly that. So again, like I said, if you don't control for other variables, so you're not controlling for life stress, you're not controlling for family environment, this kind of stuff, you'll tend to find these very, very tiny correlations between social media use and mental health. And again, this like explaining 1% or less of the variance in mental health, essentially. So what some scholars have done, I have not myself been involved in these studies, but they've looked at like genetic predisposition. So they looked at certain like genetic profiles, doing twin studies, things like that. And what they have found is that, there seems to be a common genetic component. And I think what the argument here is that some people have genes that make them more neurotic, if you will, to use that sort of big five personality, kind of thing. So they're more prone to mental health issues because of that personality style. And then they use social media, right, in order to try to improve their mood. So that same sort of personality style, which is genetically determined, causes them both to have mental health problems and to use social media more than the average person, necessarily would. And then once you kind of like, control for that genetic risk, there's no further explanatory power. Like social media use doesn't seem to actually cause those mental health problems. So those studies are pretty rare because it's very expensive, right, to do genetics, research. It's much harder to get those studies, but there now have been at least 2 or maybe 3 at this point that have all kind of come to the same conclusion, that it seems to be it's just a gene thing. And we'd actually seen that there have been some studies with television violence that actually had done the same thing, that says that turns out television violence does not make people more aggressive, that there just was a sort of genetic predisposition to enjoy violent media, and not surprisingly, in some cases, maybe be more aggressive in people's personal lives. So a lot of it does come down to, again, genetic risk, and probably again living in a more stressful environment is going to make it worse. If particularly if you already have that genetic risk.
So could you say that we choose how the algorithm will impact on us?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, that's always an interesting thing too. I mean, you mentioned the algorithm, because I always hear people like, oh, the algorithms are out to kill us or whatever. Yeah, the algorithms don't give a crap what we watch. They just want us to watch a lot of it. So the algorithms definitely are engagement mechanisms, no question about that. But they don't want you to watch ISIS beheadings necessarily. It's not their goal, is to have you watch porn or anything like that. They would show you cat videos if you like cat videos, So the reason you're getting ISIS beheadings is because you keep looking at ISIS beheadings. Yeah. So stop it. You have the control. And most of these platforms, now they do vary, like maybe like 4chan is less user friendly than Twitter is or Facebook is or whatever, or Discord, but most of these platforms, you literally can tell the algorithm, stop showing me this. You have the control right there in front of you, right? Or just stop looking at ISIS beheadings and look at more cat videos, and it'll figure that's what you want to see. I mean, it's all it's doing is, so we have this tendency, right, of something will give us what we want, but we're sort of embarrassed by that, or we see our kid seeing these things, and we can't believe that innocent little Jimmy might want to watch ISIS beheadings. So we're like, how dare YouTube show little Jimmy ISIS beheadings, when he wanted to go see Bluey, kind of a thing. And it's like, no, Jimmy's kind of an asshole. It turns out your kid is a little bit of a psychopath who's looking for ISIS beheadings. You just don't want to believe that, and he's not going to tell you that. So you can concocted this fantasy.
You have to blame someone. You have to blame someone.
It has to be an extra. People like external attributions, for their own bad behavior, essentially. So if you're getting a lot of porn, then just like stop watching porn first off, but also just click where, and most of the platforms where it says show me less of this, or block, or whatever. Most of these platforms have some mechanism to train the algorithm for you. So like I'm old, right? So I'm on Facebook, which is like social media's obituary page, right? So all for like elderly people, and yeah, I mean, like one of the things I noticed is because I'm a psychologist, I used to get ads all the time that was like, should you be in therapy? Here's the kind of therapy you can go into. And I didn't, is Facebook trying to tell me something here? I don't know. But so, I mean, eventually I know like you could do the little, it's got the three dots, right? Just do the little pull down menu and say, don't show me these ads anymore. I'm not interested. And voila, no more therapy ads. So that's how you train the algorithm. Now I see Dungeons and Dragons stuff. I see World War II tanks, and I see like 18th century houses in New England. And what do I like? I like Dungeons and Dragons, I like tanks, and I like old houses, right?
That's coincidence, or maybe the algorithm show you that, so that's why you love them.
That's why, yeah, maybe. No, I've always liked tanks.
What's a big lesson that YouTube teach me as a creator?
Yeah.
You know what? I made a long video about intelligence, and I used the story of Einstein's brain.
Yeah.
You know this story? It's very dramatic. You know the story of Einstein's brain.
Not only in the loosest way. I seem to remember that it was
stolen. It was stolen. It was stolen, and they tried to search its structure so that they find there something extravagant about his intelligence. And I start the video with this story, just for a hook.
Yeah.
For a hook. And then the video done pretty well. Then just starting to die out. And one day I was bored, and I just cut the hook part and make it a short video.
Okay.
Short videos it's like TikTok on YouTube.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So the short video was going viral.
Yeah. Nice.
And I was waiting this to happen in the main video, in the long form.
Mm-hmm.
And I started realizing that the engagement was different. Mm-hmm. I started seeing some comments like they couldn't understand that this was part of a longer video.
Oh, okay.
And the quality of the comments was very low.
Yeah.
And then I realized that they didn't they didn't search for the long video. The longer video didn't take any traffic.
Okay.
And then I learned that these were two different audiences.
Yeah. Okay.
So I realized that there is one audience that has a predisposition for short-term videos.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That cannot watch long-form videos.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And in the long-form videos, I see different comments.
Yeah.
They are themselves longer comments.
Yeah.
And of highest quality.
Yeah.
So I see that if we say just YouTube, so what do you mean by YouTube?
I mean, people are going to have different attention spans, right? I mean, yeah, you could see this with, even with documentaries to some extent, right? Where some people like Ken Burns is coming out with this new 700-hour documentary of the American Revolution or something like that, right? And some people are very excited, right? And then others are not. It's like that's been the joke for a long time, right? Because people talk about this with books, right? There's always a joke about books, and someone will say, "I'm writing a book about this thing," and other people say like, oh yeah, I'll just wait for the movie, right? You know? So yeah, I mean, people definitely vary in terms of their, you know, their desire to engage with something for long periods of time, you know, versus others. And it might depend too on like on what, even more like the context, right? Yeah, to some extent. I think there are some things like I think with videos, I don't like long videos actually, for the most part. Like if I'm trying to learn about something, or I notice this with like news articles too, like you know, like the Atlantic and New Yorker, or like those outlets will sometimes have these news articles that'll be like 25,000 words or something like that, you know. And after a little while, I'm like, oh god, I just don't care anymore. Like I don't. But I could read a book, you know, that's like 100,000 words, you know. So sometimes it really does depend on the context. Like I don't want to hear about like what Trump did lately in 25,000 words, but I'll read, you know, the latest horror novel that's, you know, 5 times that in length, you know. So I think it depends on the context too of, you know, what people are engaging with.
So, do the bans work?
No, I mean, I don't think anybody, you know, you know, I should say nobody thinks they do. Obviously, some people have convinced themselves that they just have to, right? You know, but there's no data to support that. I mean, we're seeing two types of bans, right? We're seeing like Australia's type of the social media ban for under 16. There's no reason to think it would, because we don't even have correlational data to suggest it's helpful for anything, right? Let alone causal data. And then in the U.S. and I think France and some other, I don't know, again, maybe Greece.
Here in Greece, they try to impose measures for smartphone restriction in schools.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So we have a lot of that in the U.S. You know, it's state by state here. It's not like a federal, you know, sort of thing. So some states have it, some states don't. You know, at this point, I mean, the evidence I think is increasingly clear that they don't do anything. You know, I mean, you know, we've had a number of studies come out, some that were hyped in irresponsible ways. But generally speaking, now across all these studies, we're seeing that like social media bans do not improve grades. They do not improve mental health. They do not improve, you know, student behavior. You know, even the couple that had come out and people were like, you know, were like on that side, were like, aha, study found, blah, blah, blah. Turns out, no, it didn't. No, if you look at it closely, again, like, you know, the correlation was like 0.02. You know, it was basically zero effect. It explains literally like 0% of the variance in school grades. It's just they ran 600,000 kids through this analysis, you know, and so it became statistically significant, but literally has no practical significance whatsoever. It's better evidence against these bans than for them. So we have like a bunch of these studies. Again, like I said, some that were just badly hyped by news media, but that really just do not find any evidence. And I think Florida is a great example of this, that we're now 2 years into our state ban on smartphones in schools. And the Florida National Standardized Test for students dropped to their lowest level in 20 years. Now, I'm not saying that the ban caused school performance to drop, but it obviously didn't fix anything, right? It obviously wasn't the problem that Florida schools were experiencing, you know. So, you know, the evidence just isn't there. I mean, you know, I think pretty clearly, but none of this stuff was about evidence anyway. I think it's the thing we have to admit. It's like none of these policies, none of this, like, the books, the policies, none of this is about evidence. This is about people are kind of dumb, you know, and I am too in many ways in areas that I don't have expertise in. This is just like, again, a human nature thing. People get scared about something. They easily fall for any kind of grift that, you know, caters to their pre-existing fears, and they don't really care about evidence. Because I'm not making this up. I've been told this to my face. You know, people say, "Well, here's a study that says that there's no effect here." Say, I don't care about the data. I don't care about the science. I've been told that multiple times, like with no shame at this point. So I think, like as the saying goes, if people tell you something, you should believe them, right? You know, this has nothing to do with data. This is just a feel good thing, and I think some of it's good faith. Some of it, I honestly think that old people sometimes just like to twist the screws for the young people. You know, so it really is about screwing the kids, really, but it's being presented as helping the kids. I think news media love it because it sells newspapers. I think politicians love it because it makes them look like they're doing something useful when they're not. I think some scholars, like it because it's profitable, for them. So again, that's why coming back to that theme, we sometimes follow the money, right? We should do that absolutely with the tech companies, but we should also do it with the people who are peddling fear to us, and there definitely is an industry there as well. And it may be a smaller parasitic industry, but it still is an industry that's full of shit and is just trying to profit off of our fears. And so, none of these policies were put in place because the evidence said that they would work. And if anything, they've actually made it harder to collect evidence, right? Because you can't do randomized control trials anymore, because at this point, all the kids have been exposed to the, it's done, so you can't even get the good experimental randomized control trial evidence now. You have to just settle for quasi experiments or time trends or this kinds of stuff. So, it's funny because you'll see these like reports, this happened in Orange County, Florida, which is right next door to my county, where they were the first county to put in this like really big, what they call a bell-to-bell cell phone ban. So the kids can't have it out at any point during the school day, not at lunch, not at recess, not when they're in the hall, nothing, not in the bathroom, nothing at all. And you see these like teachers would say, this is great. The kids are like singing songs, they're holding hands, they love to learn all of a sudden. They're all talking to each other. This is like utopia. And then I did a public records request. And it turned out the student data got worse. So there are more students who are being referred to mental health. There were more bullying incidences. The grades really didn't change, all that much. There were more suspensions. More kids were getting suspended because of the cell phone, policy. So the outcomes were pretty bad. And so it's interesting to see that juxtaposition, right? Like the teachers, the administrators making it sound like it's a utopia, which would be really odd in a way. If you think of like every school policy that's been attempted for the last 50 years and how none of them have done anything, and suddenly this one's the one that creates a utopia in like 2 months. But this complete discrepancy between what teachers said they were saying and the actual data from their own school, that said that they were just dead ass wrong somehow. And that doesn't mean the teachers are acting in bad faith. I think that's, again, human nature, right? They want to see something. And so that's their lens, is they only look for the pieces of evidence that support what they want to be true. Now, I also think that, being a college teacher myself, right? I don't like it when I see the students like staring at their cell phone, right? It makes me feel bad, right? So I think, it probably felt good for the teachers that, they weren't seeing that. Now, does that mean the students were paying attention? No. They were just daydreaming or doodling or falling asleep or talking to their friends or roughhousing, just like we did 40 years ago, because we didn't pay attention to the teachers in the 80s, and we didn't need smartphones to not pay attention to the teachers, but we didn't have the thing out in front of us, right? So we'd just be asleep. I remember being asleep on my desk, through many of my classes in high school. But I think it was just annoying for the teachers to see them, and now the teachers feel better, and that's probably been the big positive change, from cell phone bans, is the teachers are happier. It's not helping the kids at all, clearly not helping them at all, but the teachers are happier. So I guess there's something good came of it, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. So you're saying the most dangerous thing is that we are driving our attention to the wrong causes.
Mm-hmm.
So if there are some bad grades or some problems with attention or some problems with mental health, if we are just focusing on smartphones and social media, we're just missing the big picture. That's the danger there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, if we're worried about schools, for instance, we can just like listen to what kids are trying to tell us. I mean, in the United States, something like 70 to 80% of teenagers tell us that, high schools are a toxic mixture of boring and stressful, right? I mean, like they just hate high schools. Again, it's probably nothing new. It might have gotten worse over time, I don't know, but it certainly, they don't love it. You know what I mean? And so if you loathe something that badly, you're probably not going to learn from it, And I don't have the magic solution. I don't know. I'm not, an education policy person. I don't know what the fix is for American high schools or Greek high schools or whatever else. I just know it's not this, right? And the problem is if we're focused in on this and we have these administrators and teachers who are promising these big, positive outcomes, and they're not delivering on them, then we're not doing anything to try to fix the real problem, right? And I try not to be super cynical about people's motives, but I do have to wonder, how much of that is purposeful, right? How much do schools want to distract people's attention away from their problems onto, some external source that, it's not our fault your kids aren't learning.
It's more convenient to blame the social media, maybe.
It's definitely, again, it's human nature, right? Shifting blame off of ourselves onto others. We'd all love to do that. As much as possible, so I think there's probably some of that, going on. It's kind of like in the US. With video games, you could see examples of, particularly on the political right, of people, deliberately using video games to try to distract from gun control, right? You know what I mean? Now we can have an argument about whether gun control is good or bad, but nonetheless, it was in this case being used, to try to just stop that argument, that debate from ever happening in the first place, by distracting people with video games, right? So I think there's a lot of the same thing that is going on here, that people are trying to distract our attention away from other things that are either they're not very sexy in the British sense of using that word, or they're just hard, or they would cost more money in terms of taxes or something of that sort, or we'd have to admit that schools really kind of suck in the US, and have probably for a long time. There's a lot of entrenched interests that don't want to admit those things, and so it's just easier to kind of, well, it's just the smartphones, or whatever. The reality is like American schools have not actually changed that much in 50 years in terms of student success. In terms of like regulation, yes, they've gotten way more regulated, which has not helped. But if you look at like standardized test scores, over 50 or so years they've been keeping them, those scores have stayed mostly static. Now sometimes they go up a little bit, sometimes they go down a little bit. Those changes are very, very small, but whenever there's a change, we tend to freak out about it, right? It's like, this is the worst ever, sort of situation. But for the most part, they really have not changed all that much. Now during COVID, of course, they went down a little bit, and they've kind of stayed down, post COVID, but even with that, it's less than what people would think. So I'm sometimes it's guilty of that too, right? I said, like, Florida testing scores are the worst they've been in 20 years. That's true, absolutely true, but they're only down a little bit. What I mean? Like, there hasn't been this huge change, is the other thing. Like, for the most part, it's just static. But people freak about, these tiny little changes. You zoom in the y-axis, right? To make these tiny changes seem like they're way huger than they actually are. And then you freak everybody out, and then they're worried about, like, oh my God, kids today aren't learning anything. They can't read like a second grader used to be. No, it's not. None of that's true. Is the reality about it. Now, I do think American schools are pretty bad. I think they've always been pretty bad. They were pretty bad in the 70s and 80s when I was in American schools. I think they're still pretty bad today. I just don't think it's a new thing. And maybe there are other countries. I think Finland is like the country everybody just points to as having like the best schools, right? They have the highest standardized testing scores.
Yes, that's what the data shows, especially from the ones coming from PISA.
Yeah, PISA. Yeah. So maybe there are things the Finns are doing right, or maybe there's something about Finland. There's nothing else to do, right? It's like 3 degrees all year in Finland, so maybe the kids have nothing to do but stay in school. I don't know. But I'm being silly, obviously, but yeah, I'll be the first to admit, maybe there's something we could learn from Finland. Yeah, they're doing something right that we're not, and maybe that's what we should look at, rather than, whatever Finland was doing right, it wasn't smartphone bans, because they didn't have them, at least not until recently, right? So I think there is this like risk of moral panics, that they'll distract us from doing things that actually might be useful. Is the reality.
Nice. So, Mr. Ferguson, where can somebody find you? Find your work?
Yeah, I'm not going to give out my home address.
Online.
So I have a website. I have a
Through,
Substack.
through social media. Which social media?
Yeah.
Where,
Well,
where do you influence your people?
Probably if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's just CJ Ferguson 1111. So if you want to join me in that hellhole, you absolutely can. Also, I have a Substack, which is just substack.grimoiremanor.com. I think that's it. Anyway, yeah. I should know this off the top of my head, but yeah, that's what it is.
I will put the links below. Don't worry.
Yeah, I had it backwards. It's grimoiremanor.substack.com. My bad. And then I just have a website, which is ChristopherJFerguson.com. But of course, you can find my books on Amazon or things like that too. So
Are you writing something right now?
So I'd actually written. So my Substack, The Secrets of Grimoire Manor, is actually named after one of my books, but it's a work of fiction. So it's gothic horror, kind of a YA gothic horror novel. So I'm actually writing the second book in that series right now, but I'm going to have to think about, so I've written a couple of nonfiction books. I've written the one you mentioned, The Moral Combat, with Patrick Markey, and then I did Catastrophe, which is all about kind of like how we make bad decisions emotionally or cognitively, and that makes bad situations worse. It's all about like people crashing perfectly good planes, running back into burning buildings and all kinds of other stuff, but also things like, the American race riots in 2020 and why Germany has, gotten rid of all the nuclear power plants when they work perfectly fine and we're safe, this kinds of stuff, just bad decisions and why we make them and that sort of stuff. I think they're back to coal for some reason in Germany. And then How Madness Shaped History is the other book that I've written that's nonfiction, which is kind of what it sounds like on the tin.
This is what sort? It's a historical book. What?
That's How Madness Shaped History. So it's kind of psychology.
Which manner? Psychiatric manner. Which way? Madness.
How Madness Shaped History is a nonfiction book, and it kind of looks at how different like famous figures shaped history, but in negative ways because they were nuts. Basically, you think like Caligula, or I mean, Hitler, right? In some sense, there was a chapter in Hitler. But I tried to have some more interesting figures in there too, like Elizabeth Bathory, who was a female serial killer. Caligula does show up in there. We talk a little bit about like Vincent Van Gogh and cutting off his ear, and did Ronald Reagan have dementia? And there is a chapter on Donald Trump, in there as well to be a little bit fun. So I try to be as fair as possible. So people may or may not like that chapter. We'll see. So it's all about this idea that like great people, if you will, matter to history, but we tend to focus in on the positives, like the Abraham Lincolns and George Washingtons, and the Pericles as the Greek example, kind of situation, right? Yeah, these kind of like great people who did positive things, but my book's about great people who did negative things because they were kind of crazy. So that's kind of a fun book, as well. So I have to think about my next nonfiction book, and I don't know what it's going to be just yet. So that's on my agenda.
Okay. So, Mr. Ferguson, it was a pleasure for me.
Yeah, same here. Absolutely. I had fun.
Thank you. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Of course. Yeah. Well, thanks for thinking of me. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate your work, so I couldn't but send you an invitation.